We're back with the latest on the 2024 presidential race. Former President Trump is making multiple campaign stops this week, and he's fundraising off the news that he could face a third criminal indictment. Joining us now, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard from New Orleans, where Trump is headed in just a few hours. Also with us, former Virginia Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock and former Obama White House aide Elena Beverly. So Vaughn, kick us off here. Trump's got a big schedule in the next few days. What's he up to?
He's coming to New Orleans. That's why we're here right now. He's going to be landing at around 4 p.m. Eastern this afternoon. There are no public stops that we are aware of here at this time. He will be going to the home of a major real estate developer for a fundraiser this afternoon before making his way back to New Jersey here later tonight. For Donald Trump, though, you know, this is a major part of his campaign, the fundraising component of it. Just in the last 24 hours, the number of fundraising campaigns that note the fact that a potential additional indictment is coming is sizable. Just one of those messages said that, quote, now stands a third world tin pot dictatorship, more like Stalinist Russia or Maoist China, trying to jail me for life. Donald Trump, of course, has propagated the idea that if he were to be arrested, it could be a dangerous situation. He's going to be going to the state of Iowa on the campaign trail on Friday. He will then make his way to Erie, Pennsylvania on Saturday. For Donald Trump, this is not, hiding in the cave from this pending indictment. But for him, this is about being out there and being public and going on the offense against any potential charges that stem from the special counsel's investigation.
Elena, what are your thoughts on Trump using the indictments in these fundraising emails? He seems to be messaging sort of an us against them message there. The legal troubles aren't hurting him with Republican voters in the polls, certainly.
Certainly not hurting him at all. That's right, Anna. And as Vaughn mentioned, there's now no distinction between the campaign and his legal defense. And he's using these campaign stops. That's why I'm sure he planned for New Orleans today, because we're expecting the third federal indictment to come down today or Thursday. And he's going to use this to help prop up his fundraising numbers. He loves playing the victim. He loves using this as his legal campaign witch hunt grievance tour. And so certainly now we're seeing a new campaign strategy on behalf of the Republican Party, which is indictments can be used in your favor to both stir up a base and also to fundraise. Over half of his campaign funds to date have been used in support of his legal woes. He's not funding the bill for this. He's using his campaign dollars and dollars to his Save America PAC to defend him. And so what we're seeing is the indictments are not chipping away at his lead. He's still polling at about 46% in the polls in Iowa. And so now indictments have become the new campaign strategy of the Republican Party.
And just to be clear, he has not been indicted just yet with a third criminal indictment. We're certainly watching and waiting very closely to see if and when that happens. Congresswoman, House Republicans have been largely rallying to Trump's defense, even talking about trying to expunge Trump's two impeachments. But he's apparently upset that GOP senators aren't being very vocal. They aren't doing more to attack Biden, which is what he wants to see. What do you make of how leaders of your party have handled Trump's legal issues?
Well, it's tragic because Trump is an existential threat to democracy. He has no regard for the election process, security of elections. He continues to threaten prosecutors and threaten the election process and national security. As was mentioned, he's using so much of the money he is raising for his own defense. Essentially, I believe he's running for election in order to pay for his defense. So those who are giving him money are basically paying for his defense, not really paying for a candidate who's running for office. And in fact, the past four general election polls are showing that Joe Biden is leading him fairly handily. And I do not think Donald Trump can win a general election. So therefore, it is tragic that he is leading in Republican primaries because he is a candidate who I don't believe can win in a general election. I understand it'll be close. It'll seem like he might be able to win, and certainly it can be close throughout the process. But when you look at the swing states, when you look at the demographics of women in swing states, of independent voters in swing states, it'll very much be like what happened last year in 2022. And Donald Trump will drag down the ticket, will drag down people in those states. And once again, Republicans will lose by hitching their wagon to this sore loser who should be indicted, will be indicted again, and could very well be a convicted felon by the time we get to the general election.
In fact, we know there are multiple trials already with dates on the calendar because of the many cases that he's up against right now. Mitt Romney is somebody who has not stayed silent when it comes to taking on Trump. He's been one of the few not afraid to go there. He has this new op-ed encouraging donors to take action, writing, quote, donors who are backing someone with a slim chance of winning should seek a commitment from the candidate to drop out and endorse the person with the best chance of defeating Mr. Trump by February 26th. That's after Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina all vote in their primaries and caucuses. So February 26th, that date. Congresswoman, do you see that happening? People dropping out then?
Well, I think donors should also ask if a candidate is going to basically say it's okay for Donald Trump to be indicted or make excuses for him or validate Donald Trump, do not give money to that candidate. If you're not going to challenge Donald Trump, then don't at all endorse that candidate at all. So I think that is even a more important thing. So that's why somebody like a Chris Christie or Asa Hutchinson or Will Hurd, who's actually saying it is not good for the Republican Party to have an indicted candidate. We should not be in any way validating that or making excuses for that, or ever saying that we would support that candidate. So donors, you should not be saying that that kind of candidate who would, say Donald Trump is okay. And the RNC shouldn't force candidates to say they would ever support Donald Trump because, again, he's an existential threat to democracy.
Elena, right now there are a dozen Republican candidates in the race. North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, who announced this morning he qualified for the first debate, is one of those who hasn't really broken through at this point, but he did get 40,000 unique donors to make the debate stage. And remember, he offered $20 gift cards to people who donated even $1. Well, now he's launching a new contest where people who donate to his campaign are entered to win 2 tickets to the first debate, airfare and hotel included. What's he trying to do? What's the strategy there?
He's trying to lift up his name recognition by using his own private piggy bank, and it's working to date. That's part of the way that he was able to meet the threshold requirements, as you mentioned, for the debate. Notably, Mike Pence still hasn't met the threshold requirements for the debate. So people are trying to figure out at this point, does he have a lane going forward if he is not able to raise the funds, even though he was able to secure the 1% in a national poll and early state polling. Everyone at this point is trying to break through in terms of name recognition. But let's remember, to your former question, that if there's a plurality, that Donald Trump only needs to win a plurality if all of these candidates are crowding the field in February. Mitt Romney was clear in 2008. February was when he stepped back in order to consolidate the field for the Republicans. They need to do that this time. Otherwise, they're going to have a Trump nominee.
Elena Beverly, Vaughn Hilliard, former Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, thank you all for joining us.